Let me just say I sat in for a little bit of this morning, and it's very humbling to realize that the ambassador is the person in the room who knows the least. So I think thank you for having me, Aaron, and colleagues on the panel. I'm here in my personal capacity, so we should actually have dropped that. As a practitioner who was involved in the bad old days of Rio+5, and then now I have a WTO view of things. And another lens I want to bring is that of public policy. And how then can we try to answer these three questions that have been posed to us? Some of you will undoubtedly recognize, friends in the room, that some of the things I say bears great resemblance to our national position, but that's just because I have a true conviction and a belief in these particular positions. Let me start by saying the cross-cutting nature in issues of trade, environment, climate change, sustainable development, absolutely nothing new there. It's easy to see the conceptual linkages between these different fields, but it is much harder to keep these clear in our minds when we are designing policy to operationalize certain objectives. That challenge is faced in all the international fora that are going on. And as I mentioned that, I should also state for the record that my view is one part, only a fraction of the view of what's going on in this building. It does not represent that of other colleagues who are in the room, and I'm sure we'll join the discussion later. If I can use an analogy from medicine, when we're trying to prescribe a particular treatment, you have to weigh the consequences of the side effects. And all modern medicines have side effects. So what I like to do is to look at first principles and come back to them repeatedly so that you can see whether or not you are achieving the objective you set for yourselves. The first principle that we have upheld really is to pursue a mutual supportiveness between trade and the environment. At least we've tried to do that here. In terms of operational policy, what does that mean? It means we need to forge coherence. And I choose the word forge because this is not going to be an easy process. And it's one fraught with what appears to be competitive dynamics, although I don't personally believe that is the case. But because negotiators are always emotionally involved in very delicately balanced deals in each of our domains, we tend to not want interference. Now, this competitiveness manifests itself, in all manners of labels, turf issues, which international process has supremacy over or ownership of certain things. What we need to do, I think, is to step away without emotion and look at how we can logically deal with cross-cutting issues, bearing in mind how that we need to meet objectives. And very often the solution has to be a pragmatic one, and quite often possibly an unprecedented one. And it must always focus on coherence. This is a kind of coherence which Article 3.5 of the UNFCCC speaks to in setting out policy objectives of a supportive and open international economy which promotes sustainable economic growth and development. And at the same time, that same paragraph recognizes that measures to combat climate change must not constitute arbitrary discrimination or disguised restriction on international trade, simply because this second set would negate the first if we were to go that way. So in my view, there is no turf issue between the WTO and the UNFCCC. There's no argument that the climate change process is a competent body to forge the policy objectives to mitigate climate change. But this, however, brings us to the nexus where we have to be careful not to conflate trade-related discussions in the UNFCCC process with actual rule-making in the domain of trade. In this House, as long as we wear this red badge, I make no apology of holding the view that the WTO is the only competent body for multilateral rulemaking for international trade. The WTO should not be making climate change rules, but neither should rules on trade be made elsewhere. We should be particularly careful not to devolve this responsibility too lightly given the delicate climate we are in, which needs no elaboration on. Now, we find ourselves in a curious place where there are ongoing discussions, some of which were examined this morning, which will have a direct impact on trade, and yet not much interaction is going on. There are examples of the carbon-related border tax adjustments. There are proposals prohibiting unilateral trade measures for climate change mitigation. And there is a tendency to pursue these in siloed discussions that kind of block up inconvenient realities so that we don't have our already complex lives further challenged. Now, as a negotiator, I find wearing blinkers seldom pays off. As a policymaker, it doesn't work either, because I would want to know that what I am designing will succeed. And to do so, and to succeed without causing significant side effects, especially not in infringing obligations I may have elsewhere if you are a member state. Here, the positive role of the WTO, if I can attempt to answer the question, although the fellow panelists will do much better, is its ability to support coherence between the policy objectives that are identified at the UNFCCC and the operational viability in the world economy where such measures need to be implementable. It is the people like Patrick and Vasily who will have the data and the analytical capacity to advise if a design measure can be meaningfully implemented, whether these dovetail with or contradict members' obligations under the WTO, and will these transaction costs of these measures hamper or facilitate trade. Remember the ultimate objective of sustainable economic growth and development. These are not new dynamics when we deal with cross-cutting issues. But what I have seen here is a very professional WTO Secretariat, which is fully capable of dealing with other international bodies and processes. But let me also be very clear on my views on what, with regard to unilateral trade measures as a climate change response measure. We think this is a lose-lose proposition because it distorts trade and takes us further away from solutions. Environmental problems should be dealt with at the national level, meaningfully at their source, and not through restricting or distorting trade, which in my view imposes new problems instead of a solution. There is a positive role for trade policy as a whole in supporting environmental protection and sustainable development. Trade policy, particularly in the liberalization of climate-friendly goods, services, technologies, will complete the UNFCCC's efforts to combat climate change. These are the kinds of relationship we need to be clear about before we can figure out which institutions, what venues, what approaches might be useful to this cause. Because the same members populate both the UNFCCC and the WTO, it is important that dialogue takes place. And personally, I don't think enough of it happens today. Perhaps some members would prefer it this way because it provides a gap within which we can be creative. But let's revisit that first principle. Do we want to save the planet without foregoing growth and development and to forge coherence while we're doing this? Or are we out to just score a tactical negotiation win, which may end up fostering greater divergence between the various international processes going on? So in my view, the only way ahead is an open and transparent dialogue. The WTO Committee on Trade and Environment is one appropriate forum for such a dialogue. There's no danger of the CTE usurping the UNFCCC's authority because those same members are on both ends, and we'll see to that. The CTE is not a negotiating forum, so it cannot set about designing or negotiating new rules for climate change. By the same token, the UNFCCC process cannot ignore direct impact on trade due to the WTO obligations of those same parties. As we saw in the CTE meeting in July, this conversation can center on raising awareness on the trade-related aspects of negotiations on climate change. And from this process, we can educate and inform our own governments at a national level so that both sides of the picture are seen. We need to strive for coherence and convergence at two levels. The first is at the multilateral level amongst the relevant bodies, and I say bodies because it may well be more than two, and at the national level, where governments also need to be coherent between different ministries and agencies doing the work. By strengthening coherence and convergence, we will be better placed to discharge our respective obligations under the two processes. And it's only when this relationship is clearly understood by the members who populate these two multilateral institutions can the institutions themselves begin to better fulfill and deliver on their mandates and responsibilities. Thank you.